Have you ever, landed somewhere totally new, a place you've never been, and you realize your first impressions, how you're understanding it all, it comes less from, well, what's right in front of you, and more from maybe movies or books, stories you'd heard beforehand?
Oh, definitely. It happens all the time, doesn't it? Maybe the reality feels way different, or sometimes, maybe scarily, it lines up perfectly with what you thought, but in a way that feels a bit too easy, too neat.
Exactly. That
Yeah.
gap, right,
Yeah.
between the stories we kind of inherit and the messy, complex reality we actually find. When we're faced with something unfamiliar, we often lean back on those established stories, the understandings that have already been shaped for us.
It's a very human thing to do.
Absolutely. And today, we're taking a deep dive into a really powerful and often misunderstood idea that gets right into this, Orientalism.
Mm.
This whole concept,
Mm.
mostly laid out by Edward Said in his, well, truly groundbreaking 1977 book, it radically challenges how the Western world is historically seen and understood this huge area he calls the Orient.
Right, which is roughly, the Middle East, North Africa, parts of Asia.
And our mission today for this deep dive is really to unpack the core arguments, the history behind Said's Orientalism in a way that's hopefully accessible and clear for you, our listener.
Yeah, we want to explore how this idea of the Orient was maybe less a real place on a map and more like a complex, powerful, well, Said calls it a European invention.
And crucially, we'll see why getting our heads around this concept is so important for making sense of global dynamics, both in the past and right now.
We're going to break down some pretty big philosophical ideas, but we'll use clear definitions, analogies from the real world, so hopefully you won't feel overwhelmed.
Exactly. The goal is that you walk away feeling really well informed. So let's dig in. Okay, so to really grasp Orientalism, Said gives us basically three main definitions, and they're interconnected. They build on each other. It's pretty important to understand all three right from the start. So where does he begin? How does he start to unravel this?
Right. So, Sadi starts with the most, let's say, straightforward definition. Orientalism as an academic discipline. Simple as that.
Okay, academic discipline.
Like
Yep.
anyone who teaches, researches, or writes about the Orient. So, a scholar studying Arabic literature, a historian focused on ancient Persia, maybe a professor of Islamic studies, that kind of thing.
Got it.
Mm.
So people studying a specific region in universities, writing papers, teaching classes, that's the first layer.
Exactly. That's the literal identifiable field of study, the study of the Orient.
Okay. But I get the feeling it gets more complicated than just listing university departments.
It definitely does. The second definition, and this is where it gets really interesting, is Orientalism as a kind of pervasive style of thought. Or sometimes he calls it a
A
discourse.
style of thought. What does that mean exactly?
It means it's not just about individual scholars doing their research. It's a much deeper, ingrained way of thinking. And it's built on this fundamental distinction, this sort of automatic separation between the Orient on one side and the Occident, the West on the other.
So like an us versus them kind of mental framework.
Pretty much. And Sayed's key argument here is that this distinction, this dividing line, it's not natural. It's not just geography. It is completely man-made.
Okay, let me try and picture this. For you, our listener, imagine you're about to meet someone from a culture really different from yours. Before you even talk to them, maybe you already have this mental lens or filter you look through.
Mm.
And this lens automatically sorts everything you see or hear about them. Often it emphasizes how different they are, maybe exotic, mysterious,
Mm.
sometimes even threatening compared to us. And the key thing is this lens is there before you even meet them, shaping how you see that whole encounter. Is that kind of what Said means by a style of thought?
That's a really good analogy, yes. It's a way of seeing that exists before the actual experience, and it colors everything that follows.
Right.
And this leads straight into the third definition, which is maybe the most critical one. Orientalism as an historical relationship of power.
Power. Okay.
Yeah. Said insists you cannot separate Orientalism from power. Specifically, the power dynamic between the West and the East, which he argues has consistently been one of dominance.
So we're talking from the late Renaissance, basically, right up until today, the West held what Said calls a flexible positional superiority over the Orient.
Exactly, that's his phrase. Flexible positional superiority.
Meaning Westerners, whether they were scientists, scholars, missionaries, traders, soldiers, they could operate in the Orient, or even just think about the Orient with, as he puts it, very little resistance on the Orient's part.
Precisely. And this wasn't just about armies marching in, it was intellectual control, too. This superiority meant the Orient became this huge, complex object for the West to study and, frankly, manipulate. Yeah. Raw material for academic, something to put on display in a museum, a problem for the colonial government to fix, a case study for fields like anthropology, biology, linguistics, history, you name it.
Ah.
Said puts it very powerfully. He says the Orient was imagined and remade countless times by power acting through an expedient form of knowledge.
So the knowledge itself wasn't just describing things, it was actively creating a certain version of the Orient, even if the scholars were just trying to do good research.
That's the really shocking insight, isn't it? Knowledge wasn't neutral. Even well-intentioned research could end up serving imperial goals by constructing the specific kind of Orient in the Western mind.
So it's not about pointing fingers at individual scholars necessarily, saying they were all secretly plotting. It's more about a collective institutional way of seeing.
Exactly. An institutionalized worldview where producing knowledge about the Orient actually enabled power and control over it. It wasn't just describing, it was shaping. Hashtag tag 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 1.2. The concept of hegemony, how ideas gain power.
Okay, this power dynamic sounds really subtle, but also pervasive. To help us understand it better, Sind uses a concept from the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci, hegemony. This seems pretty important for understanding how ideas become dominant without, just using force. How does Gramsci explain it?
Right, Gramsci's idea of hegemony is really useful here. He talks about two kinds of societal control. There's political society that's direct force, like the army, the police, laws that coerce you.
Okay, the obvious stuff.
Yeah, but then there's civil society. That's made up of voluntary institutions, schools, families, religious groups, unions, media. And influence here works differently. It's not about force, it's about consent.
Consent, how does that work?
Hegemony happens when, in any society that isn't purely totalitarian, certain cultural ideas and forms become dominant, not because they're forced on people, but because people come to accept them. They internalize them as just common sense, as natural truth.
Ah, so it's when a particular worldview becomes so widespread, so embedded in everything in education and culture,
Yeah.
that it just feels like the way things are.
Precisely. It's the ideas that dominate because they've achieved widespread consent. You don't question them. They're just normal, like breathing the air, as you said earlier.
Okay, so how does this apply to Orientalism?
Said argues that Orientalism became a form of cultural hegemony. The Western ideas about the Orient became so deeply ingrained, so pervasive in Western culture, that they shaped how everyone thought, how they perceived the East, often without any conscious awareness or explicit coercion.
So that flexible positional superiority we talked about.
Yeah.
It wasn't just military might, it was also this intellectual upper hand, this assumption that the Western view was the correct one.
Exactly. The Westerner always had the upper hand, subtly or overtly, because their way of seeing the Orient was the dominant, accepted one. The knowledge produced wasn't just information, it was part of maintaining this consensual dominance.
Can you give us a concrete example from Said's work that shows this in action?
Yeah, he gives a great one. He points out that an Englishman in India or Egypt in the later 19th century took an interest in those countries that was never far from their status, in his mind, as British colonies.
Right, the fact of empire was always there.
Always. That gross political fact, as Said calls it, wasn't just a backdrop. It fundamentally tinged and shaped all the academic knowledge being produced. The scholar's choice of what to study, how to frame it, the conclusions drawn, it was all influenced, consciously or not, by the reality of empire. It was the water they swam in.
Okay, this leads us to another really key idea in Said's work, exteriority. This sounds important for understanding the one-sidedness of this whole thing. What does exteriority mean here?
Exteriority basically means that the Orientalist scholar or writer is always positioned outside the Orient, not just physically outside, but existentially and morally outside.
Outside.
Yeah. They aren't representing the Orient as it is from an internal, lived perspective. Instead, the Orientalist acts as an interpreter, making the Orient speak to and for the West. They describe its mysteries, they explain it, they make it understandable for a Western audience.
So the Orient isn't speaking for itself in these texts. It's being spoken for.
Exactly. Its own voice is kind of muted, and the voice of the Western interpreter is projected onto it, always on Western terms.
And Sid sees this happening way back, even in ancient Greece.
Yeah, he traces it back as far as Aeschylus's play The Persians from 472 BCE. It's one of the oldest Greek plays we have.
And what happens in that play?
Well, the play depicts the Persian defeat by the Greeks. But the Orient, Persia, is transformed. It's not shown with complexity, it's represented through symbolic figures like grieving Asiatic women lamenting their loss. The audience isn't getting an authentic Persian viewpoint.
They're getting a Greek interpretation.
Precisely. They're watching an artificial enactment made by a non-Oriental Aeschylus, a Greek, for a Greek audience. The drama powerfully presents Persia's defeat, but it's entirely from the victor's perspective, creating this symbolic, often flattened image of a whole region.
So this implies that even texts that seem objective, like history books or linguistic studies, are fundamentally representations. They're not just neutral snapshots of reality.
Absolutely. Said stresses that it's not always about whether the facts are correct. You need to look at the style, the figures of speech used, the setting, the whole historical and social context in which the text was produced. How is the image being framed?
Because the Orient itself, in this framework, is often portrayed as silent, unable to push back against these descriptions.
Yeah, silent, passive, unable to resist the projects, images, or mere descriptions devised for it by the West. This really highlights the profound power imbalance. The knowledge is produced about the Orient, but not by it, and usually not for its benefit.
Okay, for you listening, think about it like this. Imagine someone writes your life story, but instead of talking to you or your friends or experiencing anything alongside you, they just rely on old rumors, maybe common stereotypes about people like you, or maybe what some powerful institution thinks about you based on its own agenda. They never actually speak to you. Your own voice, your own perspective is completely absent. That's the core of this exteriority idea. The Orient is seen, interpreted, defined, but without its own direct, authentic voice being heard. It's fundamental to how this whole discourse of power worked.
So if Orientalism is this powerful, one-sided way of representing things, how did it actually start? What are its historical roots? Said argues they go back incredibly far.
How far back are we talking?
He says the basic demarcation, the line drawn between Orient and West, is ancient. You can see hints of it even in texts like Homer's Iliad. From the very earliest times in Europe, he argues, the Orient was always something more than what was empirically known about it.
So it wasn't just a place on the map, it was also a kind of imaginative space.
Exactly. A vast, often mysterious space onto which European imagination projected ideas, fears, desires, long before there was widespread, direct contact.
And this early imaginative geography, as you called it, wasn't just neutral map-making, right? It was about imposing some kind of order, maybe defining Europe by defining what it wasn't.
Precisely. It was about control, in a way. Think about Aeschylus's The Persians again. It doesn't just describe Persia. It shows Asia speaking through the European imagination. It's depicted as defeated, assigned feelings of emptiness, loss, and disaster. The Greek audience isn't learning about Persia objectively. They're experiencing a Greek narrative that reinforces their own identity, their own victory.
Okay, and what about later examples, like Dante?
Right, Dante's Inferno from the 14th century. Think about how major figures from the Islamic world are portrayed there. The Prophet Muhammad, scholars like Averroes, the physician Avicenna, these were huge intellectual figures in their own right.
Yeah, massively important thinkers.
But in Dante, they're fixed, laid out, boxed in, imprisoned within his Christian vision of hell. They're not seen as complex humans with their own agency or beliefs. They serve a specific literary function within a Western-imposed pattern. Often ignoring historical reality or their actual contributions, they become devices in a Christian narrative.
So the mind imposes order, puts things in secure, refinable places, even if the logic behind it isn't exactly rational or universal. It can be arbitrary, based on cultural values that might seem arbitrary themselves if you trace them back.
Absolutely. Like how an owl might symbolize wisdom in one culture and bad luck in another. The meaning assigned can be arbitrary initially, but it gains a kind of objective validity over time through repetition and cultural agreement.
Okay, so there's this long history of imaginative construction. But Seed puts particular emphasis on Europe's relationship with Islam. He calls it a lasting trauma. That sounds pretty intense. Why such a strong reaction?
It was intense. For Europe, Islam wasn't just some distant curiosity. It often symbolized, in Say's words, terror, devastation, the demonic hordes of hated barbarians.
Wow. Why so negative?
Several reasons. First, its proximity, both geographically, right on Europe's doorstep, and culturally, drawing on some shared Judeo-Hellenic roots. Second, and crucially, its incredible military and political successes. From the 7th century right up until the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, Islamic powers were often militarily superior to European ones. They were a real, powerful, often expanding challenge.
So it wasn't just an abstract other, it was a direct competitor, often winning right next door. That must have generated a lot of fear and, well, negative propaganda.
It absolutely did. Medieval views, for instance, often depicted Arabia as this asylum for heretical outlaws, a place of religious error. The Prophet Muhammad was frequently portrayed not as a religious founder, but as a cunning apostate, a deliberate deceiver.
And this wasn't just medieval ignorance. These ideas lingered.
They really did. Sidsed points out that even into the 20th century, some European scholars were still describing Islam as basically a second-order Aryan heresy. Meaning, they were still trying to frame it as a flawed, deviant version of Christianity, rather than recognizing it as a major world religion in its own right. It was a way of diminishing it, fitting it into a pre-existing negative category defined by Christianity.
Always trying to make it secondary, less authentic.
Exactly. There's a fascinating example from the mid-15th century. 4 learned Christian scholars, including figures like John of Segovia and Nicholas of Cusa, proposed a kind of conference with Islam.
A dialogue. That sounds potentially positive.
Well, their explicit goal was the wholesale conversion of Muslims. John of Segovia apparently saw it as cheaper and less damaging than constant warfare. Their aim was to stage the Orient and Europe together, but the script was already written. They wanted to prove to Muslims that Islam was just a misguided version of Christianity.
So not really an open dialogue at all, more like a planned intellectual conquest.
Pretty much. And Say argues this shows how the Orientalist representation of Muslims was consistently used as a way of controlling the redoubtable Orient. By defining it, classifying it, making it known, even if incorrectly, it became hopefully less fearsome. It turned a vibrant, challenging civilization into a closed field, a theatrical stage affixed to Europe, with the West always directing the play.
Okay, so we have this backdrop of fear and misrepresentation. But didn't things start to change with the Enlightenment, the rise of scholarship in the 18th century? Was there a move towards more genuine understanding?
There was a shift, yes. While earlier periods had what Said calls an ignorant but complex understanding, the 18th century saw the beginnings of more comparative study. You had scholars like George Sale, who translated the Quran into English.
Right.
And Sale actually tried to engage with Arab history using Arab sources. He included extensive footnotes where he let Muslim commentators speak for themselves, which was quite radical for the time. Said sees this as an early phase of comparative disciplines, a move towards more systematic engagement, even if still flawed.
That sounds like progress. More curiosity, maybe less outright polemic.
To some extent. But this period also saw the consolidation of a new problem, the tendency to fix identities, to classify entire groups of people.
What do you mean by fixing identities?
It's what Said calls character as designation. Instead of seeing individuals, scholars started creating broad physiological and moral classifications for whole populations. Think of labels emerging like wild men, Europeans, Asiatics. This idea of a genetic type like primitive man gained huge traction in the new sciences of the 18th and 19th centuries.
So it was like trying to apply biological categories to entire cultures.
Exactly. And within this framework, Orientals were often reduced to their supposedly primitive state, were defined solely by a particular spiritual background. It stripped away contemporary complexity and assigned fixed, often negative, essential traits, like Linnaeus classifying Americans as red, choleric, erect, or Asiatics as yellow, melancholy, rigid. These simplistic categories gained power by seeming scientific.
So it wasn't just describing what was observed. It was actively creating these boxes and assigning inherent characteristics, often implying inferiority or maybe arrested development compared to Europeans.
Precisely. And a great example of how this played out is Barthélemy d'Herbelot's massive 17th century encyclopedia, the Bibliothèque Orientale.
What was that?
For a long time, it was the definitive European sourcebook on the Orient, hugely influential. It was praised for encompassing and orientalizing the Orient, making its vastness seem knowable, organized alphabetically.
Sounds useful.
But Said points out that while comprehensive, it mostly just confirmed existing European ideas and prejudices rather than challenging them. For example, its entry on Muhammad describes him straightforwardly as the famous impostor, author and founder of a heresy.
So it organized information, but through a pre-existing bias lens.
Exactly. It represented the Orient more fully and more clearly, but entirely on European terms, reinforcing existing negative stereotypes under a veneer of scholarly authority.
It feels like, as Head puts it, cultures impose these corrections upon raw reality, turning complex things into neat units of knowledge.
Yeah, he says it's natural for the human mind to resist untreated strangeness. So, cultures tend to impose these transformations on other cultures, receiving them not as they are, but as, for the benefit of the receiver, they ought to be.
And this process of conversion isn't random. It becomes disciplined, taught in universities, linked to Western cultural and political norms.
Right.
It becomes official knowledge.
And this insensitive schematization, this flattening of diversity into manageable, often dismissive categories, becomes a really dominant theme when you look at Orientalism through the 19th and 20th centuries. It's a way of controlling the unknown by fitting it into a Western box.
Okay, we've set the stage with the intellectual and cultural construction of the Orient, often driven by fear and this urge to classify. But how did this transition from, say, abstract ideas in early scholarship into a much more concrete, institutionalized, even scientific project of domination? Edward Said really points to Napoleon's 1798 invasion of Egypt as a turning point. Why was that expedition so incredibly important for Orientalism?
Napoleon's invasion of Egypt and his brief push into Syria had, as Said says, far the greater consequence for the modern history of Orientalism. Before Napoleon, you had scholars like Enkidu Duperon, who traveled to Asia for biblical research but ended up translating ancient Persian Avestan texts. That showed an early impulse to sort of invade the Orient by stripping it of its veils, uncovering hidden knowledge.
Right, scholarly curiosity merging with a kind of intellectual appropriation.
Yeah. But Napoleon took this to a whole new level. He didn't just bring soldiers to Egypt, he brought an entire army of intellectuals.
Famous savants, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Dozens of them, scholars, scientists, engineers, artists. He wasn't just conquering land, he was conquering knowledge. He actually founded the Institut d'Egypte right there in Cairo.
An institute.
Yeah.
In the middle of an invasion.
Yes. Its specific purpose was to create a living archive, to conduct intensive studies on everything, ancient ruins, modern customs, geology, botany, language, everything. It was this unprecedented fusion of military conquest and scholarly enterprise. Egypt effectively became, as Sabe puts it, a department of French learning, a giant laboratory.
And what about Napoleon's famous proclamation to the Egyptians, where he basically said, "We are the true Muslims"? That seems bizarre.
It is bizarre. July 2nd, 1798. Nous sommes les vrais musulmans. His team of Orientalist scholars translated it all into Quranic Arabic. He even told his army to respect Islamic sensibilities. It was an attempt, Said suggests, at a uniquely benign and selective war against Islam.
Using knowledge or a performance of understanding as a weapon.
Precisely. Compare that to, say, the brutal Spanish recorrimiento back in 1513 in the Americas. That was just read out loud, threatening natives with slavery and death if they didn't submit immediately.
Much more direct.
Yeah. Napoleon's approach was way more subtle. He was leveraging Orientalist knowledge, or at least a manufactured version of cultural understanding, maybe a feigned affinity as a sophisticated tool for domination. He wanted to render Egypt completely open, not just militarily, but intellectually, to transform it from this indirectly known land into something fully mapped, studied, and accessible to European scrutiny. To possess it completely. Hashtag tag 3.2. The Description de l'Egypte and the Project of Knowledge as Power.
And the ultimate product of this scientific intellectual conquest was the massive, multi-volume Description of l'Egypte. This thing sounds like the ultimate embodiment of that Orientalist project, knowledge explicitly serving power. Can you walk us through what that work really represented?
Oh, the description was far more than just a big encyclopedia. It was a monumental statement of intent. Said breaks down its implicit goals. First, it aimed to restore Egypt. The idea was to lift it from what the French saw as present barbarism and return it to its imagined former classical greatness, implying only Europe could do this.
Okay, so a civilizing mission narrative.
Exactly. Second, it aimed to instruct the Orient. It presented itself as teaching Egyptians the ways of the modern West for their own benefit, framing intervention as benevolent modernization.
Right, we're here to help you.
Third, it explicitly subordinated military power to knowledge. The argument was that the real glory wasn't just the conquest, but the glorious knowledge gained through that political domination. The scholarship justified the invasion.
Making the intellectual pursuit the higher goal.
Fourth, it aimed to formulate the Orient, to literally give it shape, identity, defining it as an appendage to Europe, part of Europe's sphere of knowledge and influence.
Defining it on their terms.
Fifth, it worked to dignify colonial knowledge. It presented all this information gathered under occupation as a noble contribution to modern learning, even though, as Said points out, the Egyptians themselves were neither consulted nor treated as anything except as pretext for a text whose usefulness was not to the natives.
Their reality just became data points for European scholars.
Pretty much. Sixth, it empowered Europeans. It gave them the feeling of being in command almost at will of Oriental history, time, and geography, like they could master it all through study.
One sense of total intellectual control.
And finally, seventh, it aimed to transmute living reality into the stuff of texts, to capture Egyptian actuality because, in this view, nothing in the Orient seems to resist one's powers, turning a dynamic place into static, manageable text.
Wow, that's quite a list. For you listening, imagine someone writes this enormous definitive instruction manual about your past, present, future, all detailed. But, and this is key, it's written entirely without your input, your voice, your perspective. And then that manual is used to manage your life, your identity, maybe even your resources. That's kind of the effect the description had on Egypt, turning it into this object of Western control.
And what's truly remarkable is that even though Napoleon's actual military occupation failed, the French had to leave. Said argues this intellectual project, the description, didn't fail at all. Its fertility, its power to shape perceptions, endured.
The ideas outlasted the army.
Completely. Said says it gave birth to the entire modern experience of the Orient as interpreted from within the universe of discourse founded by Napoleon. The language of Orientalism changed after this. Its descriptive style became more assertive, not merely a style of representation, but a language, indeed a means of creation. It aimed to cancel out the Orient's strangeness, its hostility, by defining and containing it within these new, powerful Western categories. The physical empire retreated, but the intellectual empire, the narrative, just got stronger. Hashtag, tag, 3.3, the textual attitude and its consequences.
This idea of the Orient being created and controlled through texts leads us to something Said calls the textual attitude. What exactly does he mean by that, and why is it such a problem when thinking about Orientalism?
The textual attitude, as Said defines it, is a pretty common human tendency, maybe even a failing. It's when we prefer the neat schematic authority of a text over the messy, often confusing reality of direct encounters with the human.
So like trusting the map more than the territory right in front of you?
Exactly. Or applying what you read in a book literally to a real-life situation, which, as Said notes, risks folly or ruin because reality is rarely that simple. He points to classic satires like Voltaire's Candide or Cervantes' Don Quixote, where the protagonists get into trouble precisely because they mistake book learning for reality.
Right, like trying to live your life based entirely on romance novels or something.
Yeah.
You also mentioned travelers who find a new place wasn't what they expected.
Yeah, that often means it wasn't what a book said it would be. The text created an expectation that the reality didn't match. The book felt more authoritative than the actual place. Said mentions Fabrice del Dongo in Stendhal's novel, looking for the Battle of Waterloo based on written accounts, completely missing the chaotic reality happening around him.
Okay, so how does this textual attitude apply specifically to figures like Napoleon, or later Ferdinand de Lesseps, the guy who built the Suez Canal?
Said argues that for people like them, the Orient was something to be encountered and dealt with, primarily because the texts made that Orient possible. Their understanding of the East came mostly from books, from within that Orientalist tradition we've been discussing.
So their plans, their projects, were based on a pre-existing textual version of the Orient.
Largely, yes. And this textual Orient was silent, available to Europe for the realization of projects that involved but were never directly responsible to the native inhabitants. The texts created a reality where massive interventions, like building the Suez Canal right through Egypt, seemed feasible, even necessary, because the Orient described in those texts was passive, unchanging, and ultimately manageable by Europe.
And the silence, the lack of pushback from the Orient itself in these texts, allowed for this very one-sided interaction.
Completely. It enabled this one-way exchange where the Westerner observes, writes, plans, and acts, always maintaining their secret European power, as Said puts it. Their perception was shaped more by the library than by genuine, messy, reciprocal human interaction.
So the success of their projects, at least in their eyes, had very little actual human interchange. It was like they were operating based on the scripts they'd already read.
Yeah. Said uses a great analogy from Gilbert and Sullivan's Trial by Jury. Said I to myself, said I. It was a kind of internal monologue justified by the texts. The Orient's powerlessness, combined with the authority of the Orientalist discourse, gave meaning and reality to these huge Western undertakings, often without truly engaging the people whose lives were being fundamentally reshaped. The text came first.
Okay, so we've seen Napoleon really institutionalize this knowledge-power dynamic. Moving into the 19th and early 20th centuries, Orientalism seems to become even more systematic, more deeply woven into European science and imperial structures. Set highlights two figures here as absolutely central, Sylvester de Saussure and Ernest Renan. What was their impact?
Sylvester de Saussure, who lived from 1757 to 1838, is seen by Said as really the beginning of modern Orientalism. He was instrumental in creating a coherent body of Oriental texts for study, establishing standardized teaching methods for Oriental languages, and building a recognized scholarly tradition.
So he really formalized it as an academic field.
He did, but crucially, he also forged a direct link between this scholarship and public policy. He literally translated Napoleon's proclamations for the Egyptian invasion. He trained interpreters for the French foreign ministry. He made Orientalist knowledge practically useful for the state. Sessa describes him almost like a secularized ecclesiastic, treating the Orient and his students like doctrine and parishioners things to be systematically organized and understood within his framework.
Wow, so directly serving imperial interest. And what about Renan? He was Saussure's student, right? How did he take things further?
Ernest Renan was a brilliant philologist. That's a scholar who studies language in its historical and cultural context. He built on Saussure's foundation, but pushed it in a direction Said finds deeply problematic, particularly with his ideas about rational anthropology and the degradation of types.
Degradation of types, what does that mean?
Renan famously argued that Semitic languages like Arabic and Hebrew were fundamentally different from and inferior to Indo-European languages like French or German. He saw Semitic languages as somehow eccentric, quasi-monstrous, suffering from arrested development compared to the supposedly mature, progressive Indo-European ones.
He was basically saying the languages themselves showed that the people who spoke them were less developed.
That sounds incredibly racist.
It's deeply problematic, yes. He wasn't just talking about grammar. He was implying inherent, almost biological, differences in the mental capacities of the peoples associated with these language families.
Where did he even get these ideas, this notion of linguistic monstrosity? Said connects Renan's thinking to trends in romantic biology in a rather disturbing field called teratology, which was literally the study of monstrosities or abnormal development in nature.
Study of monsters.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah. In that framework, physical abnormalities were seen as signs of internal degradation within the species' life. Renan applied this logic metaphorically to language. So anomalies, like Semitic languages, in his view, weren't just different. They were deviations that supposedly confirmed the regular structure, the normality, of Indo-European languages and, by extension, European peoples. It was a way to pathologize difference using scientific-sounding language.
So the European scientists could effectively construct the Orient and its people in their intellectual lab, treating them like specimens,
Yeah,
an act of imperial power over recalcitrant phenomena, as Said puts it.
exactly. In this view, Semitic wasn't really a live language capable of complex thought or progress. And tragically, the implication was that neither were Semites live creatures in the same sense as Europeans, capable of self-determination or advancement as defined by the West. This systematic classification, wrapped in the authority of philology and comparative science, deeply entrenched the idea of Western superiority and Oriental inferiority within academic thought itself. Hashtag 4.2. Marx's paradox and the collective Orientals.
It's fascinating and disturbing how widespread this kind of thinking was. Said even argues that Karl Marx, someone deeply critical of imperialism and exploitation, wasn't entirely free from this Orientalist lens. How does Marx fit into this picture? What's the paradox?
It is a paradox. Said points out that even while Marx fiercely condemned the brutality and greed of British colonial rule in India in his writings from 1853, exposing the sickening human cost, he still tended to conceptualize the Orient through a framework shaped by Orientalism.
How so?
Marx famously wrote that Britain had a double mission in India, one destructive, the other regenerating. He saw the annihilation of the Asiatic society as destructive, yes, but also as historically necessary for the laying of the material foundations of Western society in Asia. He essentially argued that colonialism, however brutal, was necessary to break up stagnant Oriental despotism and push these societies towards progress, towards a Western model of development.
So he saw the suffering, but justified it as a kind of necessary evil for historical advancement. Where did his usual sympathy for the oppressed go?
He acknowledged the suffering, calling it sickening, but ultimately framed it as an unavoidable step needed to overcome what he saw as the inherent backwardness of Asiatic society, its solid foundation of Oriental despotism, and its being an unresisting tool of superstition. For Marx, the historical process moving towards communism trumped the immediate human cost in this specific context. The destruction was tragic but necessary to overcome this supposedly static Oriental mode of existence.
So even a revolutionary thinker like Marx, focused on class struggle, ended up viewing entire populations in these huge abstract categories, Asiatics, Orientals, rather than seeing the complex individuals involved.
That's exactly Said's point. He argues that Orientalists in general, and Marx in this specific instance, conceived of humanity either in large collective terms or in abstract generalities. They were often neither interested in nor capable of discussing individuals in the East.
They preferred these big labels.
Yeah. Artificial entities like Orientals, Asiatics, Semites, Muslims, Arabs, Jews, races, mentalities, nations. These broad categories dominated their analysis. Said concludes that the collective Orient was easier for him, Marx, to use an illustration of a theory than existential human identities. The immense diversity and individuality of millions were flattened into convenient abstractions that fit the larger theoretical model, whether that model was about justifying empire or predicting historical stages.
Let's shift to another key figure Said dissects, Edward William Lane. His book, An Account of the Manners and Customs of the Modern Egyptians, published in 1836, was hugely influential and praised for being so objective and neutral. How does Said peel back the layers on Lane's apparent objectivity?
Lane definitely presented himself as the meticulous, immersed observer. He lived among Egyptians, adopted local dress, learned the language, documented customs in incredible detail. He claimed this deep immersion.
Sounds like good anthropological fieldwork, almost.
On the surface. But Lane himself stated he was always aware of his difference from an essentially alien culture, even while he was outwardly conforming. And Said argues Lane's peculiar authority came precisely from this dynamic, his ability to imitate the Orient without the opposite being true.
Meaning he could blend in and observe them, but they couldn't really observe or become like him in the same way.
Exactly. It highlights an immediate power imbalance inherent in his position. Said argues that Lane's seemingly neutral first-person narrative contained a submerged part, which retains its secret European power to comment on, acquire, possess everything around it.
So his detailed descriptions weren't just neutral facts.
They were presented as neutral, but Said insists the knowledge Lane gathered was useful knowledge, not for them, the Egyptians, but for Europe and its various disseminative institutions. His intimate observations, filtered through his detached, authoritative European perspective, effectively became valuable intelligence, useful for understanding and ultimately controlling Egypt, especially as British influence grew.
So the very act of observing and writing, even if detailed and accurate in places, was itself an exercise of power.
Yes. Said calls Lane's narrative both an Oriental masquerade, him dressing up and blending in, and an Orientalist device for capturing and conveying valuable, otherwise inaccessible information. It's a one-way street. He observes, records, possesses the knowledge, maintaining his secret European power, all while appearing to be just a neutral reporter.
This brings us to a really crucial distinction Said makes, which helps explain how Orientalism could adapt and persist over centuries. The difference between latent Orientalism and manifest Orientalism. Can you unpack those two terms for us? They sound important.
They are very important for understanding the resilience of Orientalist thought. Manifest Orientalism is basically the explicit stuff, the stated views, theories, arguments about Oriental society, languages, history, art, whatever, that you find in books and articles. This is the part that can change over time. New discoveries are made, political situations shift, academic styles evolve.
Okay, so that's the surface level, the stuff that's openly discussed and debated. What's latent Orientalism then?
Latent Orientalism is the deeper level. It's the set of almost unconscious, untouchable assumptions, the core beliefs about the Orient that remain remarkably stable and consistent, largely unquestioned beneath the changing surface debates. It's the durable, often unexamined bedrock.
So while the specific arguments or focuses might change, manifest, the underlying assumptions, latent, about the Orient's fundamental nature, stay pretty much the same.
That's exactly Said's argument. He claims that this latent Orientalism remained constant. What were these core assumptions? Things like the separateness of the Orient, its eccentricity, its backwardness, its silent indifference, its feminine penetrability, its supine malleability.
Wow. Those are some loaded terms.
Extremely loaded. And Said argues that nearly every Western writer dealing with the Orient, from scholars like Renan and Salcy to literary figures like Flaubert or Nerval, even critics like Marx, essentially kept intact these latent assumptions.
Hmm.
They all, in different ways, saw the Orient as a locale requiring Western attention, reconstruction, even redemption.
It was always seen as somehow static, lacking, different, and in need of Western intervention or interpretation.
Yes. Consistently viewed as a place isolated from the mainstream of European progress in the sciences, arts, and commerce, always defined by its difference from and inferiority to the West.
Is there a good example of this latent assumption showing through, even when someone is discussing practical policy?
A classic one Said uses is Lord Cromer, who was the powerful British consul general in Egypt for many years at the turn of the 20th century.
Right, a major imperial administrator.
Cromer famously contrasted the French colonial style, which he saw as offering ephemeral attractions, like a pretty damsel with somewhat artificial charms,
Oh.
with what he saw as the solid, dependable British approach, like a sober, elderly matron of perhaps somewhat greater moral worth, a solid British nanny.
A nanny.
Cheerio. This metaphor perfectly reveals the underlying sheer privilege of British emplacement in the Orient, and the deeply ingrained belief that the British weren't just ruling, they were there to train the Egyptian's mind and form his character, like children needing guidance. He even described the British Empire as this huge palace of art, with the colonies as mere pillars supporting a vast Asiatic dome.
So the Orient isn't an independent entity with its own agency. It's just a decorative, subordinate part of a grand European structure, needing the firm hand of the British nanny.
Exactly. That's latent Orientalism in action, the unchanging assumption of superiority and the Orient's inherent need for Western management, even when discussing different colonial styles. Hashtag had 4.5, the white man as style, expertise, and authority.
This idea of the duty to train and form the character of Orientals really connects to that powerful figure of the white man, especially as invoked by someone like Rudyard Kipling. Set argues this isn't just about race, it's a whole style of being for Europeans, particularly the British, abroad. How does this style operate as a form of expertise and authority within Orientalism?
Kipling's white man figure, especially in his famous poem, The White Man's Burden, represents more than just skin color. It embodies a specific style of being, a persona, a code of conduct. It draws on what Said calls a long tradition of executive responsibility towards the colored races. It implies an inherent duty, a burden, to govern, manage, and civilize non-white peoples.
So it's a whole set of attitudes and behaviors.
Yes, it involves a particular way of speaking, often authoritative, clipped, behaving, stoic, detached, in command, and even feeling a sense of duty mixed with weary superiority. It's a reasoned position, Said notes, towards both the white and the non-white worlds, one that automatically assumes authority and the right, even the obligation, to intervene and control.
And this style becomes a way to frame experiences and control narratives. Lawrence of Arabia seems like a complex example of this. How does Said interpret him?
Lawrence is a fascinating case study for Said. His writings and actions during the Arab Revolt in World War I symbolize this intense, almost personal struggle to, first, stimulate the Orient, which is seen as inherently lifeless, timeless, forceless, into action. Second, to impose upon that movement an essentially Western shape. And third, to ultimately contain the new and aroused Orient in a personal vision.
He famously wrote, "I meant to make a new nation to restore lost influence." It sounds like his personal ambition almost takes over the whole narrative of the Arab Revolt itself.
That's precisely Said's reading. Lawrence's personal narrative, his I, subsumes the collective Arab struggle. Their complex motivations and goals become secondary, almost raw material for his own heroic story and his Western-inflected vision of what their nation should be.
So his individual perspective becomes the definitive story, for Western readers at least.
Exactly. This style, embodied by figures like Lawrence, becomes a form of displacement and incorporation by which one voice becomes a whole history. And for the white Westerner reading or writing about it, that becomes the only kind of Orient it is possible to know.
And the expertise associated with this style.
It stemmed from this supposed combination of grasping primitive categories, understanding the native mind in simplistic terms, with the ability to discern general truths behind the confusing details of contemporary Oriental life. But ultimately, Said argues, the goal of this expertise, this style, this authority, was always about preserving the Orient and Islam under the control of the white man, whether intellectually or politically. The white man was the expert, the narrator, the manager.
Okay, so we've traced Orientalism through its European academic and imperial phases. But what happens after World War II? The global power balance shifts dramatically towards the United States. Does Orientalism just fade away, or does it morph into something new under American influence?
It definitely doesn't fade away. Said argues that as the American Imperium replaced the old French and British ones, the traditional European style of Orientalism, with its deep focus on classical texts and philology, kind of dissolved and released into new forms.
New forms, like what?
The most significant development was the rise of area studies programs and institutes in American universities, particularly after the war and intensifying during the Cold War.
Area studies focusing on specific regions like the Middle East, East Asia, etc.
Exactly. And Said argues this shift made the academic study of the Orient a direct branch of national policy. Knowledge production became much more explicitly instrumental,
Instrumental.
meaning it was designed to be useful, primarily for government and business. Think strategic analysis, policy recommendations, understanding allies and adversaries, accessing resources. The focus shifted from deep historical understanding to producing practical expertise needed for geopolitical competition and economic expansion.
So less about deciphering ancient texts, more about predicting political trends or understanding oil markets.
That's a simplification, but it captures the shift in emphasis. And crucially, the underlying stereotypes didn't disappear. They just adapted to this new, more pragmatic, policy-oriented context.
Can you give an example of how these stereotypes persisted, maybe even sharpened, in this American-led era?
Said provides a really stark example from 1967, right after the Six-Day War between Israel and several Arab states. At Princeton University, the theme for the alumni reunion parade costumes was initially planned to be Arab. Robes, headgear, maybe a bit exotic, but potentially harmless. But immediately following the Arab defeat in the war, the organizers changed the costume design. The new plan was to depict Arabs with their hands above heads in a gesture of abject defeat.
Wow. That's incredibly blatant.
It really is. It shows how quickly and easily a stereotype could be transformed, literally overnight, into a vicious caricature reflecting current events, portraying Arabs not just as different, but as incompetent, easily defeated, almost comical losers. And this happened within a major academic institution, showing how these images could be normalized and disseminated. The stereotype was flexible enough to serve the political mood of the moment. Hashtag 5.2, persistent stereotypes in academic and popular discourse.
So despite the shift to supposedly more objective social science methods and area studies, Seder is arguing that the old virulent stereotypes actually continued, maybe even flourished.
He argues exactly that. He makes the really disturbing claim that even in the 1970s when he was writing, books and articles are regularly published on Islam and the Arabs that represent absolutely no change over the virulent anti-Islamic polemics of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance.
No change at all. That seems hard to believe.
It's a strong claim, but he backs it up by arguing that for no other ethnic or religious group is it true that virtually anything can be written or said about it without challenge or demurral. He felt there was a unique license to portray Arabs and Muslims in ways that would be unacceptable if applied to other groups. It pointed to a continued, deep-seated dehumanization.
Can you give some specific examples he uses to illustrate this? Where does this dehumanization show up?
He lists several quite shocking examples from the time. He cites a 1975 Columbia College course guide that apparently described the Arabic language as having every other word related to violence and characterized the Arab mind as unremittingly bombastic, just incredibly sweeping negative generalizations about language and mentality.
Contributing violence to the language itself.
Yeah. Then he points to a piece by Emmett Terrell in Harper's Magazine, a major publication, which flat out stated that Arabs are basically murderers and that violence and deceit are somehow carried in the Arab genes. Just pure, unadulterated racism presented as commentary.
That's genuinely shocking for a mainstream publication.
He also mentions a textbook survey that asserted, few people of this Arab area even know that there is a better way to live, reinforcing that old trope of ignorance and needing Western enlightenment.
Right.
And then there's the pervasive popular image, which Said sums up as the camel-riding, terroristic, hook-nosed venal lechers whose undeserved wealth is an affront to real civilization. He argues this kind of image often carried an implicit message, that Westerners were somehow more entitled to global resources like oil because we, unlike the Oriental, are a true human being.
It's just layer upon layer of negative stereotypes. Seta calls this dehumanized thought, right? Viewing the Orient as this fixed, unchanging object.
Exactly. It sees the Orient as something whose existence is not only displayed, but has remained fixed in time and place for the West. In this view, the West is always the dynamic actor, the one who studies, judges, and acts, while the Orient is just the passive reactor, the static object of the Western gaze. The West gets to be the spectator, the judge, and jury of every facet of Oriental behavior. Hashtag 5.3. The absence of literature and the political other.
Now, one really interesting point Said makes about this modern American-dominated form of Orientalism, especially in the social sciences, is its singular avoidance of literature. Why does he think ignoring literature is so problematic?
He sees it as a major flaw. Unlike many of the earlier European Orientalists who often engaged deeply with classical Arabic, Persian, or Sanskrit literature, he observes that the modern area experts tended to focus almost exclusively on quantifiable data facts, attitudes, trends, statistics.
Okay, the stuff that looks objective, scientific, what's wrong with that?
The problem, Said argues, is that it leads to a conceptually emasculated, reduced, dehumanized understanding of the people and cultures being studied.
How does literature prevent that?
Because literature, whether it's poetry, novels, plays, deals with human experience in all its complexity. An Arab poet or novelist, for example, writes about experiences of values of humanity. Their work inherently disrupts the simplistic stereotypical patterns and broad generalizations that social science data can sometimes reinforce.
It brings in the individual voice, the nuance.
Exactly. A literary text speaks more or less directly of a living reality. It offers an authentic, complex, often challenging voice that statistics or political analysis might completely miss. Its power, Said believed, comes from its connection to lived human experience, not just its usefulness for policy or its national origin.
That makes a lot of sense. Reducing a whole people to statistics loses the humanity. He gives a specific example of how this plays out, analyzing an essay by another prominent Orientalist, Bernard Lewis, on Islamic concepts of revolution. How does that illustrate the problem?
Yes, this is a key example for Said. Bernard Lewis, in this essay, discusses the Arabic word thara, which means revolution. Lewis traces its root meaning back to, among other things, a camel rising from the ground.
A camel getting up, how is that relevant to revolution?
Well, Said argues Lewis uses this etymological connection deliberately to imply that revolutionary movements among Arabs are ultimately about as consequential as a camel's getting up. He subtly taints words associated with revolution, like stirred, excited, rising up, with connotations of animalistic impulse, even bad sexuality, effectively dismissing the political seriousness and agency involved.
So he uses linguistic analysis to basically trivialize Arab political aspirations.
That's Said's reading. And Lewis goes further, asserting that the core Western doctrine of the right to resist bad government is alien to Islamic thought. This leads, Lewis claims, to an inherent defeatism in Muslim societies.
Wow. So according to Lewis, Muslims are culturally incapable of genuine resistance or revolution in the Western sense. It neatly explains away any political agency they might assert.
Precisely. And for Said, this demonstrates the infirmity, the weakness of a scholarly discipline that has become completely transformed into social science ideological expertise. He argues the language of Orientalism itself does the work here. It brings opposites together as natural, like camels and revolution. It packages human beings into scholarly idioms and methodologies, even biased ones. It ascribes reality to objects of its own making. It hides its own origins in Western power structures and presents Arabs as these static, almost ideal types. The language ends up speaking for the Arab Oriental rather than letting them speak for themselves. The framework dictates the reality. Hashtag 5.4. The modern Orient's participation in its own Orientalizing.
This is maybe one of the most complex and, frankly, depressing parts of Said's argument. He suggests that the modern Orient, in some ways, actually ends up participating in its own Orientalizing. How can that happen? How does a group internalize the negative gaze directed at it?
It's a difficult point, but Said observes a few mechanisms. One is through the academic system itself. He talks about the system of reproduction, where scholars from the Orient who are trained in Western universities, particularly in the U.S., are sometimes encouraged to feel superior to their own people, precisely because they've mastered the Western Orientalist system of knowledge about their own culture.
So learning the Western framework gives them status, even if that framework is problematic.
Potentially, yes. He suggests that within Western institutions, they might often remain in the role of native informants, providing specific data or local insights, while the real power to define the field, to set the theoretical agendas, remains with non-Oriental scholars. They become skilled operators within a system that might still subtly demean their own heritage.
They become conduits for Western knowledge about themselves, rather than creators of their own frameworks.
That's the danger he points to. And beyond academia, he sees broader cultural and economic forces at play. The global reach of the Western market economy, he argues, tends to produce an educated class within the Orient whose intellectual formation is directed to satisfying market needs.
Meaning more focus on practical skills.
Yeah. An emphasis on things like engineering, business administration, economics fields, seen as crucial for modernizing along Western lines. This often comes at the expense of humanities, critical cultural studies, or disciplines that might challenge those Western models of progress and culture. Their role becomes tied to legitimizing Western ideas.
And this leads to a kind of cultural standardization.
Yes, a vast standardization of taste, symbolized superficially by things like transistors, blue jeans, and Coca-Cola becoming globalized. But more profoundly, Said suggests, it can lead to the paradox of an Arab regarding himself as an Arab of the sort put out by Hollywood.
They start seeing themselves through the stereotypical lens created by the West.
That's the tragic outcome he describes. When the images and narratives produced by the dominant Western discourse are so powerful and pervasive, they can be internalized and reproduced even by the very people they depict and often distort. So, the modern Orient, in short, participates in its own Orientalizing, becoming in some ways an echo of the very representations that were used to define and confine it.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. The definitions, the history, the connection to power, the modern persistence of Orientalism, even its internalization. So boiling it all down, what is Edward Said's fundamental critique? What's the ultimate failure he identifies? And importantly, what alternatives does he suggest for moving beyond this whole framework?
At its heart, Said argues that Orientalism's failure is profoundly a human as much as an intellectual one. By consistently taking this position of irreducible opposition to a region it deemed fundamentally alien, Orientalism essentially failed to identify with human experience, failed also to see it as human experience.
It missed the shared humanity.
It did. It stripped away the nuance, the agency, the individuality, the rich complexity of actual people living actual lives, and replaced it with these rigid categories and stereotypes. He intends his book, he says, as a warning that these systems of thought like Orientalism, discourses of power, ideological fictions, what he poetically calls mind-forged manacles, are just all too easily made, applied, and guarded.
These mental chains that limit how we see the world and each other.
Exactly. They constrain our understanding.
And he's very emphatic that the answer isn't just to flip the script, right? It's not about creating an Occidentalism where the West now becomes the demonized other.
Absolutely not. He explicitly rejects that. The goal isn't to create new negative stereotypes, new Orientals or Occidentals of our own making. That would just replicate the same destructive patterns, the same seductive degradation of knowledge he spent the whole book critiquing. It would just perpetuate the cycle of hostility and reductionism, simply changing who's on top. The real challenge is to get beyond those simplistic binaries altogether. Hashtag 6.2. The importance of humanistic interpretation and critical thought.
So if just reversing the roles isn't the answer, what is the constructive path forward? How do we move towards more genuine understanding between cultures, according to Said?
He argues forcefully that instead of falling into these reductive conflicts that try to herd people under falsely unifying rubrics like America, the West, or Islam, we desperately need to cultivate and use the rational interpretive skills that are the legacy of humanistic education.
Humanistic education, meaning
learning how to read closely, think critically, analyze different perspectives with nuance, question assumptions, and understand context, not just accepting dominant narratives or simplistic labels at face value. It's about engaging deeply with complexity.
and focusing on connection rather than division.
Yes. He urges us to concentrate on the slow working together of cultures that overlap, borrow from each other, and live together in far more interesting ways than any abridged or inauthentic mode of understanding can allow. This isn't quick or easy. It requires time and patient and skeptical inquiry, a deep, careful engagement that resists sound bites and stereotypes.
It sounds like breaking down those false walls and seeing the messy, interwoven reality of human interaction. Said Lentz also brings up the literary critic Eric Auerbach's idea about estrangement in learning, doesn't he? How does that contrast with what Orientalists often did?
Yeah. Yes, that's a fascinating point. Auerbach suggested that real humanistic learning involves a kind of productive estrangement, deliberately leaving your own cultural home, stepping outside your familiar perspective so you can then judge it and the whole world as well, with the spiritual detachment and generosity necessary for true vision. It's about gaining critical distance to achieve broader understanding.
Okay, stepping back to see more clearly.
But Seed observes that many Islamic Orientalists did the opposite. They experienced estrangement from Islam, yes, but they never saw their estrangement, either as salutary or as an attitude with implications for the better understanding of their own culture. Instead, their distance simply intensified their feelings of superiority about European culture, often deepening their antipathy towards the entire Orient. Their estrangement wasn't used for critical self-reflection or broader understanding, it was used to reinforce their own sense of dominance. Hashtag 6.3. The challenge from post-colonial studies and beyond.
So if this dominant Orientalist system needed challenging, where did Set see those challenges coming from? What forces or intellectual movements started pushing back effectively?
He points fundamentally to the, quote, general 20th century rise to political and historical awareness of so many of the Earth's peoples. As formerly colonized nations gained independence and asserted their own voices on the world stage, they naturally began to contest the narratives that had been imposed on them during the colonial era.
The people being described started talking back.
Exactly. He also mentions specific academic movements, for example, the Revolution, led by the Committee of Concerned Asia Scholars in the U.S., who challenged traditional, often Cold War-inflected approaches to studying Asia. Similar critiques were happening in African studies.
And he highlights subaltern studies particularly.
Yes, especially the work emerging from South Asian studies, led by scholars like Ranajit Guha. The goal of subaltern studies was explicitly to rescue the writing of Indian history from the domination of the nationalist elite, who often had their own biases, and restore to it the important role of the urban poor and the rural masses. It was about uncovering the voices and experiences of those marginalized not just by colonialism, but sometimes by post-colonial national narratives too, giving voice to the voiceless within history.
This sounds like part of a much bigger intellectual shift, moving away from seeing cultures as these monolithic separate blocks.
Absolutely. It connects to the growing recognition in modern cultural theory that cultures are hybrid and heterogeneous. They're not pure or uniform, they're internally diverse, constantly mixing and changing, and they are deeply interrelated and interdependent, always borrowing, influencing, and shaping each other.
Which makes neat categories like East and West seem pretty artificial.
Very much so. Said argues this understanding reveals concepts like Western civilization itself as largely an ideological fiction, a useful political label perhaps, but one that masks the incredible historical complexity and global interconnectedness of cultures. He points to the United States as a prime example, an enormous palimpsest of different races and cultures, built on layers of global interaction and hybridity.
And these new perspectives allow for different ways of telling stories, of reclaiming history?
Yes. These efforts try to re-examine old assumptions, to get beyond the stifling hold of some version of the master-slave binary dialectic, and to find new ways to represent historical experience. Think of the complex, multi-layered novels of Salman Rushdie, the powerful historical narratives of C.L.R. James about the Caribbean, or the incredibly potent anti-colonial poetry of writers like Aimé Césaire from Martinique, or Derek Walcott from St. Lucia. They offer alternative visions, resisting the fixed, simplistic categories of the old Orientalist framework through new artistic forms. Hashtag 6.4. The enduring relevance and a call for continued critical engagement.
So bringing it all together, what's the lasting message of Said's critique for us today? Decades after the book was published, in a world still grappling with divisions and power imbalances.
Well, Saad himself, writing later, acknowledged that the fundamental patterns of power and dominance hadn't disappeared. He pointed to things like the global South being enmeshed in a debt trap, remaining economically vulnerable, and the continued dominance of powers like the U.S. So the context that produced Orientalism in terms of power imbalances certainly persists.
But things have changed too, right? Especially in academia.
Definitely. The academic landscape is significantly different than it was in 1978. There are generations of scholars now, many from the regions formerly subjected to the Orientalist gaze, who are actively challenging Eurocentric perspectives, developing new theories, and demanding much more nuanced, self-aware understandings. The conversation has become much richer, much more critical.
So the ongoing challenge the goal set points towards is to keep pushing for a non-dominative and non-essentialist type of learning.
Exactly. It's about fostering ways of knowing and learning that don't rely on creating fixed essential categories of us and them, and that are constantly aware of the power dynamics involved in producing knowledge. It requires a profound recognition that any act of understanding, especially across cultures, is potentially complicit with the power to produce such things as the Orient or the West.
So it's a call for constant vigilance, continuous critical engagement with how we learn about and represent others.
Precisely. Always questioning the frameworks we use, being aware of their origins and potential biases, and remembering that the way we construct knowledge is never, ever neutral. It always has consequences. Hashtag outro.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground today, navigating the complex, sometimes uncomfortable terrain of Orientalism. We've seen how it started as more than just a geographical term, becoming a Western invention, a style of thought, and fundamentally, a mode of exercising power.
Yeah, we traced its evolution through academic disciplines, its deep entanglement with empire, particularly with Napoleon's project in Egypt, and looked at how those core, often unexamined latent assumptions allowed it to persist.
And we saw how these ideas didn't just stay in dusty books, but continued to shape modern stereotypes in academia, policy, and popular culture, sometimes even influencing how people in the Orient saw themselves.
Understanding Orientalism really is about acknowledging that knowledge isn't created in a vacuum. It's always produced within specific historical moments, within specific power relations. It's a powerful reminder to be critical consumers of information, especially when dealing with cultures or peoples different from our own.
Edward Said's work then isn't just looking back at history. It feels incredibly relevant today. It's this urgent call to dismantle those mind-forged manacles, those rigid, simplifying categories that stop us from seeing the full, complex humanity of other people.
hmm It challenges us to move beyond the easy us versus them narratives, to cultivate genuine understanding, appreciate cultural mixing and hybridity, and resist the temptation to flatten the world into simple, often hostile opposites.
So, thinking about all this, here's something for you, our listener, to reflect on. If, as said compellingly argues, the Orient was almost a European invention, and if we increasingly recognize that cultures aren't pure isolates, but are deeply hybrid and heterogeneous, these complex tapestries woven from countless global threads, then what responsibility do you feel you have as a well-informed person to actively seek out diverse, authentic voices? To find narratives that challenge the familiar categories and types you might encounter every day?
How can you personally contribute to that slow working together of cultures that said hoped for rather than inadvertently feeding into a manufactured and dangerous clash of civilizations?